Every developer has a preferred style of coding. Some people prefer spaces for indentation, while others swear by tabs. Some like to include trailing commas at the end of a multi-line array, while others don't want to add absolutely anything at all. Regardless of your coding style, these preferences can create inconsistent code bases that mask subtle bugs and make your applications difficult to maintain over time. This is especially true with dynamic programming languages like Ruby, where you don't have a compiler or a preprocessor by default to let you know of these issues. That's where static code analysis tools come into play. These tools can quickly scan your codebase to detect performance issues and spot errors in dynamically typed languages like Ruby, JavaScript, and Python, where your code can hide nasty bugs that only surface when executed. Having these checks will help you identify problems earlier, where it's much easier and much cheaper to fix. Static code analysis also helps ensure your team follows consistent styling throughout the codebase. This is especially important for developers working on teams. Without defined standards for your projects, everyone is going to write code in their own style, which doesn't seem to be a problem initially, but eventually makes your codebase a challenge to maintain. Static code analysis also has a secret benefit besides catching potential bugs and keeping your code consistent. I've noticed that these tools foster a culture of quality within development teams, teaching them best practices and how to avoid common issues in their code. Having frequent touchpoints helps us learn how to write cleaner and more efficient code. If you're working on a Ruby application, the de facto static code analysis tool of choice is Rubocop. Rubocop is a static code analysis tool that helps teams enforce coding standards and spot those subtle errors that might otherwise go undetected. It's a flexible tool with an extensive set of rules or cops that can be customized for your team's needs. Rubocop also has a robust extensions ecosystem to go beyond its core functionality. For example, you can find extensions with cops targeting performance, Rails applications, and RSpec tests. No matter what kind of Ruby application you're working on, Rubocop will have what you need to keep your code organized. Setting up Rubocop when you start a new project will help you keep your codebase organized as it grows. In fact, the upcoming Ruby on Rails release for version 8.0 will include Rubocop by default. Unfortunately, not all developers are blessed to work on greenfield projects that have static code analysis set up. Many developers have to work on long-lived applications that have gone through many hands and will likely contain different coding styles scattered throughout. If you're working on an older Ruby project, getting Rubocop set up for your workflow can be overwhelming. You'll likely receive hundreds, if not thousands, of warnings the first time you set it up. So how can you deal with that? In this video, I'll go through setting up Rubocop on an existing Ruby on Rails project to give you a few tips on how to get your existing projects using static code analysis to improve their long-term maintainability and make it much easier for developers to work on their tasks. For this video, we'll work on a Ruby on Rails application I built called Airport Gap. This application was built to help developers and testers improve their API testing skills. I started building this app over 5 years ago and have continued to keep its dependencies up to date. However, I never really set up static code analysis for this project. So let's change that by installing Rubocop in this application and get it set up to ensure that I keep the codebase clean and consistent from here on out. The first step to install Rubocop in a Rails application is to include it in the gem file. Let's open the project's gem file in our code editor and add it there. So I have my code editor open here and I will open the gem file. And it's just a matter of adding Rubocop to this file. When setting up the Rubocop gem, it's a good idea to set it up with a version lock for the latest stable release, since future releases of Rubocop can change some functionality. So we'll add the latest stable release here, which is 162. Also, we don't need to load the gem since Rubocop is meant to run as a command line tool. So we'll set that up too by adding require false here. Since Airport Gap is a Ruby on Rails application, we'll also include the Rails extension for Rubocop, making sure to set a version lock and setting require to false. So the name of the gem is Rubocop Rails. And the latest stable version as of this writing is version 2.24. And will require false. One thing to note is that the Rubocop extensions are maintained separately from the core Rubocop gem, so they won't always follow the same versioning pattern. As you notice here, the extension is version 2.24, while the main extension is 1.62. So this is just something to keep in mind when you add other extensions in the future. So with the gems set up in the gem file, let's install them in the project using bundle install. So in the terminal that I have open here, just run bundle install. And we have it all installed already. Now that the gems are set up in the project, we could actually begin using Rubocop immediately with the default rules or cops. We can run our first static code analysis simply by running the Rubocop command in the root of the application on the command line. Rubocop quickly scanned the codebase in less than a second and printed out all the offenses it found. As you can see here, we can see that Rubocop found 431 offenses in 71 files for our project. Airport Gap is a small Rails application, so this number is actually pretty small. For larger applications, don't be surprised if you see thousands of offenses the first time you run Rubocop. Now, don't worry about having so many offenses in your application. As mentioned, these are the results using Rubocop's default rules. However, in most projects, you're going to want to tweak these to fit your existing application and how you and your team prefer to style your code. To do this, we'll need to create a configuration file that Rubocop reads from to determine which rules to use. When executing the Rubocop command, Rubocop will search for a .rubocop YAML file in the root of the project. If it can't find one, it'll continue looking up your directory structure. If it can't find any files, then it'll use the default rules as it did with our first run here. To ensure everyone who works on your project uses the same rules, it's highly recommended to have the configuration file inside your project directory and under version control. Let's set this up by running the Rubocop command with the init flag specified. Running Rubocop with this flag will create an empty .rubocop YAML file in the project root. Opening up the file shows some information on how to use the file, but otherwise it has no configuration. So if we run Rubocop again, it'll show the same results as before. We can begin setting up rules in this file to begin chipping away at the warnings Rubocop found, but addressing each issue individually will take way too much time. Instead, Rubocop has a few ways to kickstart this configuration by creating a to-do list of existing offenses for you. This way, you can see which rules you want to correct and enforce, and which ones you can disable moving forward. Setting up this initial to-do list can be done with a few additional command line flags. First, we'll delete this Rubocop YAML file, since we're going to regenerate it again. And then we'll use a few new command line flags to generate that file along with some new ones. The first command line flag is autogenconfig. This flag creates a .rubocop YAML configuration file as before, but it also runs Rubocop with the default rules and creates a second configuration file called .rubocop_todo.yaml. This file will contain the configuration to disable rules for all existing offenses. Having this separate file allows you to see where Rubocop is raising these offenses while having them disabled while you address them. A companion flag to set alongside autogenconfig is autogenOnlyExclude. Rubocop metrics rules are configured to set a minimum or maximum number for a specific offense, like the maximum length of characters in a line of code. The autogenconfig flag that we set first will set these values to its maximum, but it's a better idea to simply disable these rules altogether at the start instead of having a max to make it easier to address these issues. That's what the autogenOnlyExclude flag does. Finally, another useful flag to include in this initial pass is the noExcludeLimit flag. This flag will ensure that the to-do configuration disables rules only for the files that have offenses instead of entirely disabling the rule. That means Rubocop will find offenses for new files, which can help you decide whether you want to address the specific rule or not. Let's execute the Rubocop command with these flags to see what it does. So Rubocop ran its analysis and it created two new files this time. The first is the Rubocop YAML file that we saw before. Now, instead of not having any configuration, it'll have a single setting to inherit from another file. This is helpful because we can begin configuring Rubocop for current use while having a separate file with things to address for the existing code. When we open this inherited Rubocop to-do YAML file, we'll have a lot of configuration automatically generated for us. When Rubocop scanned the application's codebase, it disabled all of these offenses that it found so that they don't bother us again while we set our configuration. Running Rubocop again, we'll see that it won't find any offenses this time. With this initial configuration in place, we can now begin to address the issues that popped up in our to-do configuration. I won't go through all of them in this video, but I'll show a few tips to begin reducing some of these offenses and setting up the rules that we want to keep in place. So scanning the Rubocop to-do file, the first cop that shows up is this bundler order gems. So Rubocop's rules or cops use the same naming pattern with a group or library as the first part of the rule, in this case bundler, and the second part being the name of the rule that's under that group, in this case order gems. So the first time you use Rubocop, you probably won't know exactly what these rules do, so it's a good idea to have the Rubocop documentation open along with documentation for any extensions that you have. Rubocop's documentation is really well organized, and I highly recommend having these websites close by anytime you work on Ruby projects that have Rubocop set up. So in our browser, we'll go to docs.rubocop.org and it'll open the documentation for Rubocop. In this case, cops for the bundler group are set in the main Rubocop library. So let's open the cop documentation and go to the bundler group. Next, we'll look for the order gems on the sidebar. The documentation tells us that this rule checks if the gems in a gem file are alphabetically sorted within groups, and that it's enabled by default. We can see a couple of examples of what Rubocop considers bad and good. It also shows some example on how it works with different configuration settings, like this treat comments as group separator setting. Sorting the gems in alphabetical order might be important for you since it's useful to quickly find gems in larger gem files. Personally, I don't care whether the gems are sorted in my gem file for this application, so I really don't want Rubocop complaining about this. Going back to my code editor, I'll go to the main Rubocop configuration file, and under the inherit from setting, I'll add the bundler order gems setting here, and then set the enabled setting to false. This tells Rubocop to not enable this rule by default. I'll also remove the rule from the to-do configuration since it'll now be handled from the main configuration file. After saving these changes, let's rerun the Rubocop command to make sure we set it up correctly. After disabling the rule and removing it from the to-do, everything is looking good. That addresses the first rule for our project. Let's take another rule from our to-do list to handle. The next one that shows up is this layout common indentation setting. This is another rule set up by the primary Rubocop gem. So let's go back to the documentation, go under the layout group, and search for the comment indentation group. So this rule checks if all of our comments are indented properly without any weird spacing, and it's also a default setting. Our initial scan shows that this offense is happening only in one file. So let's open this file and see if we can spot the issue. So scanning down the file, I don't see anything, but if you can see here, we see one comment here that has incorrect indentation. So this is why Rubocop is complaining about this one. I would like to have comments to be aligned across my code base so that the code doesn't look really messy. So I do want to have this rule enabled. Since this offense is happening only in this single place, I can make the corrections quickly here and remove the rule from the to-do configuration. Let's do that now and rerun Rubocop to make sure everything still looks good. So I'll fix the comment here so it lines up with everything. I'll go back to my Rubocop to-do file, and since this problem is already fixed, I can delete this rule. So let's rerun Rubocop to see if that fixes the issue. And it seems like it is. In this example, we had only one offense to fix, which was pretty easy. But what if you had dozens or hundreds of offenses in a single rule to address? In some cases, you can have Rubocop automatically fix them for you. So let's show an example on how to do that now. So going back to our to-do, let's find one rule that has more than one offense. Well, towards the end of the file, we'll see the style string literals rule that's enabled here, which has 207 offenses spanning multiple files. So let's go to the documentation to see what this one is about. So going to the documentation, we'll go to the style group and we'll search for string literals. So this rule basically checks if the quotes match either single quotes or double quotes in the application. By default, it enforces single quotes if there's no interpolation in a string like this. So this one is valid, but just plain double quotes are not valid. So I know I tend to use double quotes most of the time for strings, even when they don't have any interpolation. So that's why the number of offenses for this particular project is high. However, I know I'm pretty inconsistent with single and double quotes across the application, so I would like to have some consistency around this. The consensus around the Ruby community is to use single quotes, which matches Rubocop's default. So I want to do that, but I really don't want to go through each one of these files and change it in 207 places to correct these quotes. So if you notice in the comments above this rule, it says that the rule actually supports autocorrection with the autocorrect flag. If we remove this rule and run Rubocop with the autocorrect flag, any offenses that Rubocop finds are going to be automatically updated, so we don't have to go through all this tedious work ourselves. Let's see an example of this. So I'm going to open this first file where the first offense is happening. So I'll open this file and then I'll find the place where I'm using double quotes without any interpolation. So it seems like there's one particular issue here. Rubocop is complaining that we're using double quotes here without any interpolation. So just to show how this works and how Rubocop automatically corrects these issues, I'm going to go back to the to-do configuration and I'm going to delete this entire rule. Now, if I run Rubocop again without the flag, it's going to complain that it has all these offenses and the issue is still going to be here. However, if I run Rubocop with the autocorrect flag, it'll still see everything, but if you notice at the end, it'll say that all the offenses were corrected. And if we see in our file, we'll see that it now has single quotes. So now if I run Rubocop again, we'll see that it doesn't have any issues with this because everything has been fixed throughout the entire application. So now we have one less rule to deal with. So after seeing this, I'm guessing you're thinking, why not use the autocorrect flag for everything and let Rubocop automatically fix whatever it can? So as tempting as it is to do this, I really recommend against doing any type of autocorrections at the beginning of the process, especially when you have a lot of issues to address. Rubocop can do many autocorrections safely, like converting strings from double quotes to single quotes, like I did in the example right now. But not all automatic corrections are safe, and it could lead to unexpected behavior down the road if you're not careful. Going back to the to-do configuration file, let's find an example of a potentially unsafe autocorrection. Scanning through the file, I found a good example, which is this style safe navigation rule. The comment here says that Rubocop does support autocorrection, but it is an unsafe autocorrection. So let's go to the documentation and see what this rule does. So the documentation here says that this rule looks for non-nil checks on a variable and converts it to use safe navigation, which is the ampersand dot operator. The documentation also includes a safety section to let you know why this autocorrection is potentially unsafe. Let's go back to the code and I'll open one of the files that Rubocop detected to see where the issue is. So let's go to this tokens controller. In this controller file, we can see this conditional check for the login action, where we're checking to see if this user variable is set with a user object and also if the authenticate method for that object is set to true. The offense that Rubocop found is in this first clause, where we're checking if the user variable is set without explicitly checking that it's no. So to see what Rubocop wants to do with this, let's go back to the to-do configuration and let's remove this file here. And then if we run Rubocop again with the autocorrect all flag to perform the unsafe autocorrection, we can see that Rubocop changes this line from how it was before to using the safe navigation operator. In this instance, this automatic correction wouldn't break the condition because the user variable will either be a user object or it'll be nil. So the safe navigation operator will handle these cases pretty well. But let's say, for example, this user find by actually returned false. So if this was false instead of nil, then this autocorrection will actually break the code because the safe navigation operator won't be able to handle that case. Essentially, for unsafe autocorrections, you're going to need to verify each offense first before deciding to use autocorrections. You really can't use these unsafe autocorrections blindly because it can eventually break your code. So another reason why you don't want to use autocorrections at the start is because there's some places that simply can't be corrected automatically by Rubocop. So let's go back to our to-do file and let's find another example. In the middle of the file, I found one rule that doesn't have a comment saying that it supports safe or unsafe autocorrection, which is this lint shadowing outer local variable rule. The documentation for this rule says that it checks for the use of local variable names from an outer scope in blocks, and it cannot be automatically corrected. Let me open the file where this problem is happening, which is in the seeds file, to see if I could quickly spot the offense. So scanning through the code, I can see that the problem is in this piece of code here. I'm setting this user variable in the outer scope for this section, but I'm also using the same variable name inside of the block. This code works, but reusing variable names inside these blocks like this can lead to some confusion down the road, especially if the code inside the block is pretty long and pretty lengthy. So it's best to actually fix it right now. So to fix this, it's pretty easy. I'll just change the block variable to something else and then use it inside. Let's remove the rule from our to-do list. And let's rerun Rubocop to make sure that this change is pretty good and it looks like it's still working. So we've been able to address some of the issues from the to-do list that Rubocop automatically generated, but we still have plenty of issues to address for the project. I won't go through each and every one of them in this video, but the ways I've shown how to address them will help you begin tackling any issues found when you're running static code analysis for the first time in an older code base. Going through each of these steps will take some time, especially for larger apps, but it's definitely worth the effort for a cleaner and more maintainable code base. Static code analysis is one of those things that might not seem necessary, but it does provide a ton of benefits, especially in larger development teams and older code bases. Setting standards for code consistency and quality is a quick and easy way to spot issues early, helping with long-term maintainability. It doesn't seem like much, but an organized codebase goes a long way in making your applications more reliable and much easier to work with. Hopefully, this video gives you a good starting point for adding static code analysis to existing Ruby on Rails applications using Rubocop. Once you have these basics running, you and your team can begin enforcing these standards by running them early and often. Rubocop takes just a few seconds to analyze your code and integrates really well with modern code editors and continuous integration processes. Having these checks in place will save a ton of headaches down the road. I plan to cover this topic in a future video, but let me know in the comments if there's anything else you'd like to see me cover next. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing to this channel for more tips on helping Rails developers ship their code with more confidence, from development to deployment. You can also check out my website for more in-depth articles covering Rails, testing, DevOps, and other software engineering topics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.